welcome back to another episode of Monster Thoughts TV. If you do not know who I am SC Parris, the author of the Dark World series. I love monsters. So I decided to make a podcast where I talk about monsters with other monster lovers. And this is the second episode. And today we have the lovely EnolaLugosi with us. She's a Seattle native and she's a part-time horror content creator. They host a horror podcast as well called Slay Away, and they love graphic design. We are going to talk about werewolves today, and I'm so excited because I'm not a werewolf person, but you know, I love vampires, but you can't have vampires without werewolves. So we're just gonna jump right in. Hi, Enola.
Hey,
Hi.
how's it going?
It's going good. Enola, we're gonna jump right in.
Great.
How did you come across werewolves?
Yeah, so I have a lot of stuff to say and I took some notes, so hopefully that's fine. I'm gonna kind of read off of those a little bit because it helps me. But werewolves and monsters are something that I've always had a really strong interest in from a young age, and it was something that my grandmother actually got me into with horror films. So when I was little, the first horror film that I recall ever watching was Silver Bullet. The film was released in 1985, and it's the story of a young disabled boy and a town that's preyed upon by a serial killer who rips his victims apart. So, wow, big shocker, probably a werewolf. But it was adapted from a Stephen King short novel called Cycle of the Werewolf, and King actually also wrote the screenplay for the film. And so the townspeople, they never put together that the perpetrator is a werewolf, but Marty, the name of the young boy in the film, he does, because on one foggy night, he narrowly escapes being attacked by the the werewolf himself, thanks to like the aid of his motorized wheelchair. And Marty is actually played by Corey Haim, so super popular in the 80s. I don't know if anybody has seen it or not, but if you haven't seen Silver Bullet, please go watch it. Representation of the werewolf in this film, I think, is really phenomenal as like a wolf human hybrid version of a werewolf, and we only get peeks of the monster throughout the film until the final sequence. And I don't want to spoil like the twists and turns or who the werewolf is in the film, especially if you haven't seen it, because I feel like to some people it's probably kind of lesser known, but it's a fantastic film, and that's how I came across werewolves initially. And I think I was like between 5 to 7 at the time.
Oh my god, you were so young. 5 or 7 and watching.
I got into monsters early.
I did too. My first vampire thing that I can remember was Bram Stoker's Dracula, and I was like, I don't even know, 8 or 9, I think, and I watched that and I was like, what the hell is that? I am hooked.
That experience definitely kind of like unlocked my interest in monsters, and then I dove into everything else, like from the Universal movie monsters and things like that from there, so it kind of just continued to build on itself for sure.
I find that so interesting. I have never watched really any of the Universal except for Dracula, but I couldn't make it through it because I was laughing so much because his face was just, I couldn't do it. But yeah, I found it funny that you and Reva both mentioned the Universal monsters as like your I don't want to say stepping stone, but like I mean you've watched all of them, would you say?
I don't know that I've actually watched all of them because I have less of an interest in like the Phantom of the Opera, which was actually like a Universal monster, which is kind of interesting.
I didn't
but I
know
like
that.
absolutely, I love Frankenstein. I love The Creature from the Black Lagoon. I love The Bride of Frankenstein. I'm actually not as into The Wolfman, but it's a great film, and probably we brought it up because I know we talked about it a couple times recently on Slay Away, so it's fresh in our minds. But those 3 for sure, Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, and Creature from the Black Lagoon is one of my favorites, because if you think about the special effects of the time period, that whole entire getup that the creature has on and how they shot that is really, really cool.
Okay, so like that you mentioned the werewolf in London. So given that the werewolf is a fairly popular monster in today's lore, are you a fan of drastic changes to the creature? Like, are you a fan of like the walking / running on all 4s, or being able to talk while in werewolf form? Like, what are you a fan of in your werewolves?
Yeah, so I thought about this a little bit, and there's really a lot of folklore and varying tales of characteristics of werewolves, but I don't think that the wolf form or walking and running on all forms is actually something that's a drastic change from the initial folklore that came about, because the appearance of a werewolf in animal form really varies from culture to culture, but it's most commonly portrayed as being very indistinguishable. Sorry, I can't pronounce words. From ordinary wolves, save for the fact that they don't have tails. So that's like the big distinction between them. But that's interesting because it's actually a trait from early witch trials that was indicative of witches in animal form, because during the witch trials, several women were actually accused of like lycanthropy. which is
Mm.
really interesting if you go dive into the history a little bit. But however, I know the lore states that werewolves are often larger than wolves that are found in nature, and they retain like their human eyes and voice. So that's sort of an idea that they can speak in wolf form, physically, like verbally. You can hear them and they can speak. So that's something interesting to me, and I don't know if it's something we've seen really depicted well, because if you look at Underworld, they don't speak in wolf form at all. And they're more like the human wolf hybrid. And then if you look at things like Twilight, where we're
Oh
talking
God.
about a psychic connection
Oh
in
God.
Twilight and the
Oh
ability for
God.
wolves to like communicate telepathically in wolf form, that's a totally different story found in a very different part of native
Mm-hmm.
folklore. So it does seem plausible to me, but I don't really know much about it beyond that work of fiction. So it's tough to say. For me, I think I like my werewolves I don't mind them in wolf form, but I think I actually like them in wolf human hybrid form. I like the very scary version of the beast. So, which is interesting because an American Werewolf in London, it's very much in wolf form, but it's an extremely large wolf, like because
Mm-hmm.
it's down on all fours.
Mm-hmm.
But if it were to stand up, you would get that version from
10
Underworld, where
foot
it's like
tall.
a
Yes.
same kind of thing, like tall, very tall, menacing. Like if you saw this shadowy figure of a wolf on the wall coming at you or something, like snarling and
Mm-hmm.
drooling and just like ready to attack. I think that's the version of the wolf I find really interesting because it's scary, but at the end of the day, it's like, okay, well, I guess that version of the wolf where the human side of goes away. So even if you watch Being Human, for example, the werewolf in that, when he's in wolf form, he doesn't remember anything
Mm-hmm.
from when he's a wolf. When he's a human again, whatever happened while he's a wolf, it's like an alter ego, kind of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde situation.
I think I remember
So
that show.
I think that's interesting.
Yeah, I love that you said that because in my series, shameless plug, real quick. In my books, my werewolves are lycans, I call them. They talked whilst in their lycan form. So I thought I should like mention that because I didn't see a point in having this beast if they can't talk. Like my dragons talk in my series
Right.
as well. Like you should be able to. I mean, I
Well,
could do the whole
it's just like
telepathic thing.
if you go back to Grimm fairy tales with the wolf speaking to Red Riding Hood, right?
Mm-hmm.
In their wolf form, and they're very much, I think they're depicted as like a wolf that can stand. They've always spoken. So it's not something that's new. So actually, them not speaking in wolf form and being more of an animal we can't understand is, I think, the newer thing that I would take from something like Underworld, where they don't speak. Um,
They just
but
like
they're highly
snarl.
intelligent still. Like
Yeah,
and they do recall being human, and they can change at will and stuff like that. So,
yeah.
um,
So you did
interesting.
answer my question, my next question, which is
Sorry,
do they,
I have
yeah,
some long answers in here.
no, that's fine. Do they have to be large hulking figures? And basically, yeah. So who or what is your current favorite iteration of a werewolf in books or movies or video games today, and why?
I this was interesting because honestly, there's really not a lot of representation of lichens in current video games. One of the most popular was probably the Fable series. So if you ever played Fable 1, there was where the sister is, I hate to ruin Fable for everyone, but it's been a while, so sorry. But essentially the mother and sister of the boy in Fable are like kidnapped by a werewolf clan of some kind, and they become wolves themselves, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Or one of them becomes like a fighter and was attacked by a werewolf and things like that. So that's a good representation in video games that I really like. But I think the most recent games that have been released are Werewolf the Apocalypse
Yes, I was
First
gonna mention
Blood, which
that.
is like an RPG, which I haven't played yet. But I want to because it looks really interesting. And then in October of last year, Werewolf the Apocalypse Heart of the Forest, what's like the earlier version of that,
Mm-hmm.
was released also. There's a couple other werewolf games that I have in my backlog that I'm hoping to play. One is, I think, just called Wolf. It's a Little Red Riding Hood darker version of that story.
Mm.
Because the Grimm fairy tales for that story is actually much darker than what like Disney or whoever adapted them for
Yeah.
children. These were not children's stories when they came out. So, but there's actually a book series and a character, Mercy Thompson, who's a shapeshifter in an urban fantasy book series by Patricia Briggs. And The book series is the same name, and it's set in the Tri-Cities area of Washington State. And Mercy's next door neighbor is a werewolf, and she has several dealings with like the pack, the local
Mm-hmm.
werewolf pack in the area. So I really like the representation of werewolves in that series. And the first book of that series is called Moonfall. So I don't know if anyone's ever checked that one out, but I like that representation as well.
Okay. Also, for representation, real quick, vampire. I don't know if you've ever played the game, but there is a werewolf-like
There,
figure that like you fight a lot,
a
but
really difficult fight at the
yes.
very. I couldn't get past the first part of the game because the fight is so difficult
Yeah,
and
I
the
if
dialogue
my
really quickly.
my earliest
So
streams were me cursing and screaming while chat was cheering me on, trying to figure out how to kill this thing. And then you find out that there's like a
it's
bunch
so
more
hard.
that you have to fight. But it's interesting that in Vampire, those beasts aren't, they're just another form of vampire. They're not lycans. So that was interesting that they added them, but they kind of didn't at the same time. Okay,
Yeah,
so
and I'm you mentioned, you're all about vampires, and I like both, but I am actually more of a vampire person than a
yes,
werewolf person as well.
yes,
So
more vampires. Yes.
I love vampires, and
Yeah.
if people can't tell from my name, I'm a big fan.
Vampires are awesome. Can you tell us a bit about any werewolves you may know about that we haven't discussed?
Yeah, that we haven't discussed today. So there's a lot of like I don't know any specifically from like urban legends or myth or folklore in my area, but I know there's probably a lot of lesser known werewolf films that are out there, like Howl or the newer film The Wolf of Snow Hollow, or even Werewolf Woman, which is a 1930s or 1970s werewolf a horror film. So as far in film, those are a few that people may not know about, but I couldn't find any in my general area that were some kind of urban legends that people haven't may not know about.
Can we talk
So,
about
but I love
Howl?
looking up those things.
Can we talk about Howl for a little bit? I love
Yes,
that. I love
it
that
came up
movie.
recently because I think Shauna McDonald from The Descent is in it. I loved The Descent.
Did
So.
I? Yes, that's when the guy's on the train or something,
Mhm.
and there's the yeah. Oh my god. Okay, so me and the hubby watched that. We reviewed that for Monster Thoughts, like not just a review, not TV. And I love the depiction of them in that movie. Like I'm a stickler for depictions of my monsters in
Yeah.
movies, and I love the depiction. Like they were, as far as I can remember, they were just like the hulking tall figure. Spoilers. He became one at the end, which was great.
Well, and I love that's the thing that's really interesting about werewolves is oftentimes people are turned by accident from like a
Bites.
bite or an accidental scratch or something like that. Whereas with vampires, there's so much more intent behind it usually
Mm-hmm.
when you turn someone, and it's a
Mm-hmm.
whole ordeal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, like the accidental bites and everything. So let's go back to Twilight. So for the Twilight version of werewolves, I guess you want to call them that. I don't call them that. You were saying something about them that was like a separate folklore or like for the Native American.
It's folklore that's steeped in a specific culture, so
Mm-hmm.
it's not even really a werewolf. It's the shapeshifter
Shapeshifter, yeah.
version. Like I mentioned to you before, I think there's sort of actually two distinct kinds of werewolves, if
Mm.
you will. There's shapeshifters who turn into wolves who can turn at will, and then there's werewolves, or what we think of as werewolves, which is someone who has the curse of the werewolf. It can only turn at certain times under the full moon and things like that. Like it's not necessarily a choice. So I think there's really two distinct versions of werewolves. So, but as far as depictions of wolves in shapeshifter form and what they did for communication in that film, it was kind of something, or film and book series, it was something that was kind of new, not easy to depict on film.
Yeah.
Did they get it quite right? I don't know. But yeah, like I thought the whole telepathy thing was sort of an interesting, or telepathic communication was an interesting new drastic take on communication, because in traditionally, wolves could always just speak
Mm-hmm.
verbally and you could understand them. They were speaking like they were humans, not just people who turn and have no sense of their humanity. still.
Yeah. So what's your thoughts on, have you seen Hemlock Grove? What did you think about how they did, I guess that would be the werewolves or the shapeshifters, because they didn't have the hulking form, they just turned into wolves, like big wolves.
Yeah, they turned into wolves. I remember it being really disgusting and
Yo,
gory.
that got my
It's been a long
attention.
time since I've watched it.
Yes.
But I remember the young guy when he first turns, and I'm like, he literally sheds his human
Yo,
skin
and he eats it!
and becomes a wolf.
And
Yeah,
he
and then he
eats
eats
it!
it.
Oh, I was like, but that was
It's like,
that was so
but it's
intense.
interesting because that was like a take where it's like, okay, so I literally turn into this whole other
Being.
being and shed my like just in the grossest way, just shed my human form.
Yes.
It's
And
like,
was that a curse? Or was that what their
I think
family was
so.
gifted with?
Maybe it was an affliction, but like turning in that way seems like a
A
curse to
curse.
me.
But I think his whole family could do it because they were Romani, a direct opposition to the Skarsgård brother, who was the vampire with the, like, their mouths could dislodge. That was amazing. Flowers the Gamer is asking, so in the movie American Werewolf, is that like an actual werewolf or a shapeshifter?
In an American Werewolf in London, is that the
Yeah, I
film?
think. Mm-hmm.
So American Werewolf in London, that is a werewolf. He's scratched or bitten and turns on the full moon. Can't turn at will. And he has like all these other urges around that time period.
Mm-hmm.
But he full on turns into like big bad,
That
doesn't know what he's doing
transformation
wolf form.
scene was
Mhm.
incredible. Like, I watched it with my mom like years ago and I was like, oh my goodness, like,
Yeah,
oh,
I think there's
that's
a debate
disgusting.
about whether American Werewolf in London or Howling have the best transformation scene because they came out the same year.
Howling?
But yeah.
I'm gonna have to look that
But I think
up.
I don't know. I can't really say between the two which one I like better. So
Mm, that's fair. I mean, Hemlock Grove was like disgusting for me. Like, it caught my attention.
it
That's when I was like,
definitely
oh,
knew.
I'm interested. And then when you get the whole reveal of that the friend enemy is the vampire thing, that was an interesting take on vampires, but we're not gonna talk about that right now. Oh my gosh, I forgot he ate skin. Yeah, they ate their skin. So it was, yeah, it's like Enola said, they're two different beings at that point because why, like, to me it's like, okay, they're eating their skin after they transform into a wolf.
It's almost
Why
like
would you eat that? Yeah.
when you become your dark form or something. That's where I got into like the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing. It's
Mm,
you're like transforming into this other personality that
yeah.
you don't even know, you may not even know is there. And I don't remember exactly after transformation what the depiction of the werewolf is in Hemlock Grove and like how he operates in the world while he's in wolf form. But that's usually
Can't
I think
remember.
there have been other stories or depictions of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde where um like Mr. Hyde is actually a werewolf
Mm,
because it was a story where you could make that work.
yeah.
So, I'll have to look that up. It's kind of interesting. Now gonna be on a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kick. So I'll have to look into it a little more.
Okay. So Enola, I want to thank you for stopping by Monster Thoughts TV and sharing your lovely information and knowledge on werewolves. Where can everyone find you on social media?
Yeah, so on socials, you can find me pretty much all over the internet at EnolaLugosi. So Lugosi like Bella Lugosi from Dracula. And my horror and true crime podcast, Slay Away, is at Slay Away Radio on Twitter, Anchor.fm, and Spotify. It's pretty easy to find us.
I want to thank everyone for stopping by today for the second episode of Monster Thoughts TV. We had a wonderful discussion about werewolves, which is, I'm always down to talk about some ferocious monsters. So I will see all of you for the next episode and then my next stream. So I will see you guys later. Thank you for stopping by. Bye.